In this presentation, we will walk you through the documentation needed for Oklahoma's Academic Assessment Monitoring Program. The purpose of the AAMP is to evaluate school districts and sites' implementation of both federal and state required assessments. The AAMP has established a 5-year monitoring cycle where all school districts participate in desk monitoring at least once every 5 years. There may be some circumstances where OSDE will also schedule an on-site visit for a particular site within your district. Each year, the Office of Assessments posts the list of districts with the sites scheduled to participate in desk and on-site monitoring to our Test Security and Assessment Monitoring webpage. All monitoring types require districts to submit information in the desk monitoring checklist. That checklist is very important. Those checklists are also revised on an annual basis. Your district will be notified of any on-site monitoring at least 10 working days before the opening of the testing window. New for 2021 is the AAMP Handbook. It's designed to help districts walk through the monitoring checklist. The handbook is aligned to the desk and on-site monitoring checklist. Each areas of the checklist is addressed in the handbook, and the handbook also provides examples of what a complete plan might look like and has pertinent information that you'll want to look over for meeting compliance. There are specific requirements your district must meet to be considered compliant. Basically, the way monitoring is set up is that districts will submit evidence for just the sites scheduled for desk and on-site monitoring. DTCs will want to work side by side with each site on that list to make sure that they provide sufficient evidence. For example, each site will have various written plans that address specific components. There are some things, though, that DTC can gather, like the training records, but all documentation that the district will submit as evidence aligns to the desk and on-site monitoring checklist, which we will be going over here. The desk monitoring checklist is divided into 2 parts. The first part of the checklist is documentation you as a district will provide to our office. The second part of the checklist is comprised of evidence that our office will gather from Cognia, ACT, SAT, and we'll also look at IEP and 504 plans for students in your district as applicable through EdPlan. First, we will look at the documentation the districts and sites will provide. For line item 1, districts will provide training evidence for BTCs, TAs, and TPs at the sites on the monitoring list. Districts must provide completed and signed test proctor observation logs for all the testing sessions. Again, this documentation is required only for the sites being desk and on-site monitored at your district, which for some of our smaller districts, it may be their entire district. BTCs may be trained one of 2 ways. They may either attend the OSDE provided DTC in-service training. If BTCs attend the OSDE DTC training, then all you will need to do is submit their training certificate as evidence. The other option is for your district's official DTC to train BTCs. If this latter option is chosen, then you must submit a training record. The record needs to include the sign-in sheet. It needs to have the date of the training, include the training's agenda, who provided the training, and lastly, printed names and signatures of the BTCs, which confirms their attendance. New in 2021, TAs and TPs are trained via OKEdge. Districts may submit evidence of TA and TP training one of 2 ways. In OKEdge, they can obtain their certificates and submit those certificates. The other option is also through OKEdge, and DTCs may go in there and they can run what's called a course record report. If you choose to submit this course record report, it will prompt you which format do you want to save the file to, and we ask that you submit that file to us in the CSV format. I've included a link to directions for downloading that report. These directions are found on the Cognia Help and Support site under Training and then Resources. Item 2, districts must submit a testing schedule for each site that's being monitored. We do require districts to use the official schedule of testing. That can be found on Cognia's Help and Support site. Remember, all fields must be completed in that schedule. Line item 3, test security. Each site will provide a written plan describing specific procedures to maintain the security of test booklets, test tickets, answer documents, and access codes. The second thing each site's test security plan must address is transferring secure testing materials to an alternate site of instruction. This is a component that is required in each site's plan, even if the site does not have an alternate site of instruction or, say, a situation where testing will occur at an alternate site. And again, if you are looking for some additional guidance, we recommend that you go to the AAMP Handbook for that. For line item 5, calculator use, each site will provide their own plan for how they implement the state calculator policy. In that plan, you'll need to include who oversees the implementation, how students have access to their calculators on the day of testing, and just kind of a general overview of how that calculator policy is used. For line item 6, each site will provide a detailed emergency plan. The plan must address student illness, power failure, alarms going off, and evacuating the building. The sites will need to address how the testing materials will remain secure during this emergency as applicable, how the emergency affects students in the case of makeup testing, and also you'll need to address how the testing environment will remain secure and who completes that test irregularity form. For line item 7, each site will need to provide their own accommodation plan. The plan needs to address procedures for providing the state-approved testing accommodations. The sites will need to address who is responsible for verifying the student receives the accommodation and that the accommodation is also listed in the student's IEP or 504 plan. Nonstandard and emergency accommodations are addressed later on in the checklist, so they would not be addressed in this plan. Line item 8, provide the school's written plan for unaccommodated students who need additional time completing their test. These are students who are not on an IEP or 504. The plan must include the location in the building where students are going to continue testing and how materials and the testing environment will remain secure during that process. Testing invalidation is caused by a situation where test security has been breached and students must retest. In the case of a security breach, the DTC will submit a test invalidation request through the testing status application, which is found in single sign-on. Examples of test invalidations are listed on this slide. Once OSDE approves the invalidation, the student is considered a non-participant. Unless, however, if the district administers a breach assessment, then the student would have a record for taking the test. Line item 9 is security breaches. Each site will write a plan for how security breaches are handled. You will need to include the person who determines a breach has occurred, who at the site requests the test invalidation to the DTC, and the procedures for completing testing for those students that were affected. A test irregularity is considered as something out of the ordinary that does not actually affect the outcome of the test. So this would be something like student illness, distraction, maybe a misread script, maybe a student was given the wrong accommodation on the day of testing. A test irregularity does not require a student to retest, but the student may be re-administered the same test form. In some cases, all irregularities are self-reported by the person who observed the irregularity. The irregularity is reported using the test irregularity form. That form is found at the Cognia Help and Support site. Next is line item 10. Each site will provide a detailed procedure for self-reporting test irregularities. The plan needs to include who completes the test irregularity form and how, if this is applicable, will testing be completed. Line item 11 is emergency accommodations. Sites scheduled to be monitored will provide plans for implementing emergency accommodations. This plan is required even if your site did not use an emergency accommodation. An emergency accommodation is used if prior to or during testing, the school principal or the designee determines the student is in need of an emergency accommodation. The Form EA must be completed and submitted to the DTC for approval. This form is then retained at the district level, needs to be kept for no less than 5 years. The EA form is found on the Cognia Help and Support site, and that is not something that you submit to OSDE, but again, you would keep that for your own records. In order for a student to use a non-standard or unique accommodation, the accommodation must meet prior approval by OSDE. These requests are submitted through the non-standard accommodation application found in single sign-on by the district testing coordinator. All requests are due by February 1st each year. Like state-approved accommodations, these non-standard or unique accommodations must be utilized during instruction by the student and written into the student's IEP or 504 plan. Line item 12, non-standard accommodations. Each site scheduled for monitoring will provide their own plan for proper implementation of non-standard accommodations. So this is required even if your district did not use the ELA test read aloud accommodation or any type of unique accommodation. The sites still need to come up with a plan for implementing this. The remaining items on the desk monitoring checklist are collected by OSDE. Line items 13 through 16 are vendor supplied information. OSDE will collect evidence that district test coordinators completed their test preparation in-service training. We will also collect building and security forms. In addition, we will collect security forms and seating charts from ACT and SAT. Please remember all test booklets and materials must be turned in on time. Security forms must be completed and signed electronically using DocuSign, and these must be completed no later than the last day of the OSTP testing window. Line item 17 is regarding students with disabilities. Students on a 504 plan or an IEP must have valid eligibility documentation and have an IEP or 504 plan in effect for the current school year. The OSTP approved accommodations used by students must be documented in an IEP or 504 plan. This is also true for non-standard and unique accommodations. All accommodations must be used routinely as part of classroom instruction and assessments throughout the year by the students. In addition, OSDE may sample a selection of IEPs for review, and we do that through EdPlan. All monitoring documentation must be received by the OSDE no later than June 23rd, 2021. Failure to submit your documentation by June 23rd, 2021, unfortunately, will result in an automatic non-compliance status. To submit your documentation, you may email it to assessments@sde.ok.gov, or you may mail a flash drive to the address on this slide. That concludes our training on desk and on-site monitoring. If you have any questions, always feel free to email assessments@sde.ok.gov.